In 1667, the Dutch handed the English an island. They gave it away, willingly, at the negotiating table. Their own signatures on the paper. That island was Manhattan. And for the next 200 years, the Dutch were certain they had robbed the English blind. To understand why anyone would trade away the future site of New York City and walk away smiling, you have to see what they took in return. It was a piece of land you've never heard of, barely 2 miles long. And to hold on to it, they had already done something the world has spent 400 years trying to forget. The island was called Run. It sat at the far edge of the Banda Sea, in what is now Indonesia. It was one of a tiny cluster of volcanic islands lost in open ocean. There was nothing strategic about it. No gold, no harbor worth naming. What Run had was trees. One kind of tree. A tree that, in the entire world, grew nowhere else. It produced a seed. And when you dried that seed and ground it, you got a spice. Nutmeg. Today, it costs a few dollars and sits forgotten at the back of a cabinet. In the 1600s, it was worth its weight in gold. And at times, more. A single stack, carried from these islands to a market in London, could set a man up for life. European physicians swore it could hold off the plague, and in a century ruled by plague, that made it the most wanted substance on earth. Whole fleets were built, whole companies founded, on a spice that grew on a few square miles of soil, no larger than a town. Whoever held these trees held a price the entire world would pay. The Dutch wanted all of them. The problem was the people already living there. The Bandanese had grown and traded nutmeg for centuries, on their own terms, selling to whoever sailed in. Arab merchants, the Portuguese, the English. The last part was the problem. As long as anyone else could buy nutmeg, the Dutch could not own the price. And the company that ran their trade, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, had no intention of sharing. In 1621, a governor named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen arrived in the Banda Islands, with a fleet and a decision already made. What followed is remembered now as the Banda Massacre. Cohen's forces killed, enslaved, and drove out almost everyone. Of roughly 15,000 people, fewer than 1,000 remained. The island's leaders were beheaded. The survivors were shipped off or worked to death on plantations handed to Dutch colonists. Plantations growing the same nutmeg their families had tended to for generations. On Run, the English still had a foothold, so the Dutch cut down every nutmeg tree on the island. If they could not yet own Run, no one would profit from it. This was the price the Dutch had already paid. Years before Manhattan was ever mentioned, by the time they sat down to make the trade, the blood was long since spilt. So, in 1667, when the Second Anglo-Dutch War ended, and two exhausted empires met at Breda to divide the spoils, the choice in front of the Dutch looked simple. The English were holding New Amsterdam, a muddy, fur-trading outpost on the far side of the Atlantic. A few thousand colonists on land the Dutch had bought years earlier for about 60 guilders worth of goods, and the Dutch were holding the last thing standing between them and total control of nutmeg. They gave up the outpost. They kept the spice. By every rule of their world, this was not a blunder. It was a masterstroke. They walked away with a monopoly on the most valuable commodity on the planet, and left the English a swamp. And for a long time, they were right. For over a century, nutmeg poured wealth into the Netherlands. Run stayed Dutch. Manhattan grew slowly, unremarkably, into a colonial town nobody in Europe thought much about. In the 1700s, seedlings were quietly smuggled off the islands and planted elsewhere, in other tropics, under other flags. Slowly, then all at once, nutmeg began to grow in places the Dutch did not control. The price the world had paid started to fall. and a spice that had been worth killing thousands of people for became, within a few generations, worth almost nothing. Run went quiet. The forgotten island stayed quiet, and the muddy outpost the Dutch had been so relieved to hand away became the center of the modern world. They were not fools. They made the right trade for the world they lived in. History simply changed the rules underneath them, and the one thing they were sure would stay scarce forever turned out to be the easiest thing on earth to grow. There's a small jar of it, most likely in your kitchen right now. People once crossed oceans and emptied islands for what's inside of it. Today, it waits at the back of a shelf, cheap, unremarkable, reached for maybe 1 week a year.